Dr. Blaufarb, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. At the outset, would you please explain this point for our audience? Napoleon was and continues to be a national hero for the French. I get that, no problem. But was Napoleon, in fact, French?
Yeah, well, the short answer is yes, he was French. He was born a subject of the French king by 1 year only. Had he been born a year earlier, he would not have been born French. But
Wow.
during, in fact, during his mother's pregnancy with him, the island of Corsica was conquered by France and surrendered to the armies of the French king and accepted the French king's sovereignty. And then Napoleon was born a few months later. So he was actually legally French, but just barely. That's the short answer. The long answer is, what do you mean by French? Um,
Yeah.
the thing you have to understand is that the Kingdom of France before 1789, before the French Revolution, was composed of approximately 40 distinct provinces, each with their own laws, institutions, customs, and specific political relationship to the crown. So instead of thinking of France as a unified country, as a nation that was kind of laterally unified, think of it more like a bicycle wheel in which the king is the center holding 40 spokes together, and without the king there is no political unity in France at all.
Dr. Blaufarb, when you talk about these 40 distinct provinces and the way you described it with their distinct legal system and administrative system, this doesn't sound like a kingdom anymore. This sounds like an empire, right? You almost have
Well,
40 different, almost like nations almost.
that's right, and those provinces indeed
Wow.
called themselves nations.
Oh, they did.
They did. The Corsican nation, the Provençal nation, the Breton nation. And in fact, the majority of people living in this decentralized kind of kingdom, this provincialized kingdom, the majority of people don't even speak French.
I'm
The
sorry, say that
majority,
again.
the majority of people in the kingdom don't speak French.
So in Brittany at that time, or I don't know, name any other province, they didn't necessarily speak French.
The vast majority of, especially in Brittany, the vast majority of the 2 million or so inhabitants of Brittany did not speak French. The people who speak French are the elites. They tend to be what we would call, I guess, the bourgeoisie and the nobility and the clergy. The elites speak French. It's a kind of like state language. It's the language of royal government. And indeed, it's the language of government. It's the language of legal documents. But ordinary people, peasants who compose 85% of the population, most of them do not speak French. They speak
So, so
Breton or Corsican in the case of where Napoleon was born, or they speak Occitan in the south of France, and we can go on and on and on.
do remnants of these languages exist? If we go to Corsica or Brittany, do we hear people still?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Oh, fascinating.
especially those two provinces. So Corsica is the Corsican language, which is a variant. It's related to Italian. I'm not sure if it's considered a separate language or a dialect of Italian. It is widely spoken. Corsicans speak Corsican at home to each other and in the streets to each other as well. French is for tourists and dealing with government bureaucrats. Um,
Oh, wow. This is so fascinating.
in Brittany, it's a bilingual like education system, kind of like in Quebec, or maybe not Quebec, like Canada, I should say, where Breton is widely taught alongside French, and I think something like 10% of Breton kids go to an all Breton school. They're actual attempts to revive these languages.
Oh, wow. I don't think that. I don't think most Americans appreciate that diversity of cultures and languages in France. We just think of it as France, right? We don't
Yeah.
think of it this way. Let's go back to a term that you used at the outset of our conversation. You said, yes, he's legally French. And I get that. Uh, you know, within a year of his birth or before his birth, Corsica is conquered by France and it becomes legally part of the French kingdom. But if a person is legally part of a sovereignty, are they French at heart?
That's a great question. Well, let me answer that. Napoleon's family, his father and mother, they were Corsican nobles. They had a certain level of influence, particularly around the city of Ajaccio, and They had fought to keep Corsica independent. They had fought against the French.
Oh,
But
wow.
yes, they had, absolutely. When Napoleon's mother is pregnant with him, his father is off with the Corsican armies trying to drive away the French. But once Corsica surrendered, Corsicans had a choice. Do we make our peace with the new French order and try to get ahead in it, or do we dig in our heels and become kind of lost cause, diehard rebels? Well, the Bonaparte family, Napoleon's father Charles Bonaparte, and his wife Letitia, they decide, you know what? We're going to accept reality, and we are going to make peace with France and try to get ahead by offering our influence as local notables to the new French government. They are rewarded for this by the French governor of the island. The entire Bonaparte family reaps many benefits from the French government. One of which is the young Napoleon is awarded a free, all tuition paid place in one of France's military preparatory schools. And that's why he goes off to France and eventually becomes an officer in the French king's armies.
From what you were saying earlier about languages, I'm now curious, Dr. Blaufarb. Napoleon goes to France from Corsica, and Corsica is just above Sardinia, which continues to be Italian now. So he goes as a young person, um, even a boy, to France. Does he speak French?
No, when he leaves Corsica, he doesn't speak French. And in fact, before he lands in France, and before he's actually put in the military school, I believe he's given some crash courses in French, so he's not completely
How
lost.
old how old was he then?
I believe he was 8.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
So
give or take a couple of years. He
yeah, yeah.
was an 8, 9, something like that.
So the future emperor of France doesn't speak French as a youth. That's really interesting. So I'm trying to make sense of this, Dr. Blaufarb. How does he rise to power? I mean, it's so unlikely.
Well, it's extremely unlikely. The key thing I think that we have to keep in mind is that Napoleon rose to power through politics, and
Politics.
particularly the politics of the French Revolution. He did not rise to prominence because of exploits on the battlefield. In fact, the first time Napoleon really served with in a French army fighting on foreign soil against a regular foreign army at war with France was in 1796 when he was, I don't know, in his mid 20s. He Until then, Napoleon's entire young early military career had been spent essentially repressing civil disorder within France and fighting using force in the context of France's revolutionary internal political struggles. He was a political general. He wasn't a battlefield general at all.
Oh, this is so interesting because for most people, including I, we think of Napoleon as this, military genius. His heck, he's still his strategies are still taught in military schools. But you are not negating that necessarily. You're talking about his initial rise to power. This is a specific thing that you're talking about, right?
Yes,
Specific.
exactly.
Okay.
So the French Revolution breaks out in 1789,
Mm-hmm.
and it's only in 1796 that he goes off to join one of France's regular field armies, the Army of Italy. Interestingly, he joins that army as its commander in chief. His first posting to essentially a regular fighting military force is as its commander in chief.
Wait. Let me interrupt you here. And the reason I'm guessing here, correct me if I'm wrong. And the reason he's appointed to be the commander in chief is not because he's got decades of battle experience. It's because of politics. What you just said.
Yes. He had exactly,
Oh,
over the course of the revolution between 1789 and 1796, Napoleon had on several instances, each instance more important than the other, had proven his worth to the revolutionary regime in power as a kind of, strong man, as the kind of armed force at the disposition of the revolutionary political leaders if they were being threatened with civil war and secession, as in the case of Toulon, the city that Napoleon reconquers, I should say, for France at the end of 1793. A city that had risen up against the revolution, had welcomed in British troops to protect it. Well, Napoleon crushes that revolt. That's an internal revolt against the French Revolution. And later on, in 1795, he's going to put down a massive uprising of Paris, of the Parisian population against the revolutionary government that's ruling there. He literally protects it by surrounding the government buildings with cannon and delivering his famous whiff of grape shot. And
yeah, yeah.
for all of these services as a political general, as a kind of, how should I put it, the sword of the political regime against its internal enemies. For all of his services in this regard, he is finally rewarded with command of an actual army, the Army of Italy, and that's the first time he shows up in the foreign war.
That is just really interesting. I'm going to make another guess, somewhat educated based on what you were saying. You said he crushed revolts, he suppressed massive uprisings, and I've read about this many times. He literally opens cannons on people. Do you do you think he was perhaps more ruthless and determined in crushing these uprisings than his counterparts or his comrades that were actually born in France? Is it because he was not French and he didn't he he was Corsican and it was easier for him to put down and or
No, that's an interesting theory.
yeah,
I mean, certainly before Napoleon comes into the picture, when he's just a lowly lieutenant of artillery in 1789, when the revolution breaks out, there's a lot of obviously rural, rather urban uprising in the capital, in Paris. The
yeah,
people rise up and take the Bastille, and so on. They march on Versailles in October, and so on and so forth. Um, the royal government, in those instances of popular uprising, prefers to turn to foreign troops. About 25, yes,
interesting.
25% of the French army in 1789 is composed of foreign regiments. And the particular regiments that are seen by the crown in 1789 as the specialists in putting down urban revolt and civilian dissent are the Swiss regiments. There are about 10 or 12 Swiss regiments who are serving on the French king under special contracts, and they are seen as totally obedient to their officers, totally cut off from the French population, subject to much
Oh,
harsher discipline
wow.
than the normal French army, and they're seen as kind of like the royal government's police force, and they are deeply hated by by the civilian population.
Um, I think there's a monument to the several hundred Swiss guards that protected Louis the 16th, and they were slaughtered by the French people. I think that monument is in Switzerland. I've read about it. Um, you know, you and I could talk about Napoleon for hours on. He's a fascinating person, character. I've read many books that are biographies. If you just look behind me, most of these are actually biographies that make history into stories. Uh, when I was speaking with you prior to our podcast, you said you've had many requests. You've turned down many requests to write biographies of Napoleon. Why is that?
Well, first of all, to be accurate and modest, it wasn't many, but it was more than one request. Let's
Okay,
put
more
it
than
that
one.
way.
You are being
And
modest.
and
You're right.
and on top of that, it was at the time of the bicentennial of I guess, when was it? It must have been around 2014 or so. The bicentennial of Napoleon's fall from power, Waterloo, all of that, and
Yeah,
so all the publishers were looking to come out with Napoleon biographies, thinking that there would be a market for a general market for books
yeah.
on him. But I thought, no, I can't do this. There's several reasons why I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
First, it has to do with me. I'm just not really good at reading the internal thoughts and sentiments of people who are dead, who died, over 2 centuries ago. I just don't feel comfortable doing that. And in fact, it's hard enough to read the inner life, to know the inner life of anyone you meet on the street today, or even family members. People are complicated. Um, and I would not even remotely presume to write a biography of anybody. Now, Napoleon is particularly frustrating, I find,
Uh-huh.
because for several reasons. First of all, he was extremely careful to curate his public image. He,
Oh,
he was always aware. It particularly begins when he takes command of the army of Italy. He always was very aware that how he was seen by the public, by the government, had a kind of political value, and so he deliberately shapes his image. For example, in 1796, when he's commanding the army of Italy, he uses his own money to publish two army newspapers, that are sent back to France, that are circulated in France, that do nothing but proclaim what a great military genius he is.
oh,
Um,
wow.
he was a
Wow.
he was a propagandist for himself, always. And as he goes on in life, as he becomes more powerful, as he becomes first consul, then emperor, it gets even more extreme. So Napoleon, the expressions of Napoleon's thinking that we have are extremely oriented toward massaging his public opinion. They are not. We have no intimate diary of Napoleon. We don't have personal letters of Napoleon. We've got a lot of kind of business letters, but not really the kinds of things that, in my opinion, would allow us to really get at his internal being.
Interesting. So it's not like looking at the correspondence between Abigail and John Adams to see what they're really like in person, or Washington's, or anything like that, George. And that's really fascinating. We'll be back after a short break to talk about how Napoleon changed France. Dr. Blaufarb, how did Napoleon change France?
That's the big question. Um, I think it really begins with his seizure of power in 1799 and the first couple years of his time as first consul following that seizure of power. The main thing Napoleon does, the most important thing he does, the thing on which everything else rests, including his ability to remain in power for the next 15 years, is he is able to end the French Revolution. He is able to end the disorders and conflicts of the French Revolution, while at the same time maintaining some of the revolution's principal gains, particularly the idea of equality before the law.
That's
One
funny
law
because he
for
became an
everybody.
authoritarian leader.
But equality and authoritarianism go together very nicely. The thing
They
that
do.
very much equality, this is Alexis de Tocqueville.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
this was what he said this probably most persuasively of all. He said that equality actually is antithetical to liberty. There's a tension between equality and liberty. Liberty depends to an extent on inequality, but if you have a state in which everyone is absolutely equal before the law, um, that makes it much more easy for an authoritarian ruler in control of the government to impose his will on those people.
Wow. That's okay. That's like a whole podcast onto itself. Dr. Blaufarb. First of all, Tocqueville, Alex, though Tocqueville came to the U.S. and did a tour of our prison systems. I think what was it in the 1820s or something like that?
I think a little later, but yep,
A little
that's right.
later. So he was not.
Before the Civil War. Yeah.
Yeah, he was post Napoleon. It's interesting that he says that. Um, uh, let's go back. I'm purposefully not going to ask too many questions and follow up to that equality theme because that could be a whole different conversation onto itself. You said seizure of power, 1799. So did Napoleon stage a coup?
Yes, Napoleon comes to power in a coup d'état. It's
Wow.
a planned seizure of power. Um, he's not actually the guy who plans it. The person most responsible for planning this seizure of power is a fellow named Sieyès, a former priest who had been a revolutionary in 1789. In fact, Sieyès is the man most responsible for the French Revolution of 1789. He is instrumental in creating the National Assembly and in giving that National Assembly the means of seizing power from the king and holding on to power. So in a way, this character Sieyès, uh, he he engineers 1789, he engineers the revolution, and then 10 years later, disenchanted with what had
Yeah.
happened, he engineers its overthrow. For him, for Sieyès and his plot, Napoleon is simply the general they need. They need a bit of armed force just in case the legislature resists the transfer of power that Sieyès is trying to engineer. And Napoleon is just the general they managed to recruit.
The right
He was
instrument.
actually their second or third choice. They had approached other generals, some of whom had refused. One of them had said yes, but was then killed in battle. And so Napoleon is not even their first choice.
Oh, that, wow. Talk about sort of fate. So was Sieyès disenchanted once more when Napoleon declared himself emperor?
Yes, well, the problem is Sieyès had a whole plan cooked up to essentially make himself Sieyès he essentially a kind of king. The title he gave himself was Grand Elector of France, and he would live in the former royal palace, have 20 million pounds revenue every year, in all respects, be exactly like the King of France, except that Napoleon outfoxes him. Once the one he Napoleon, this shows what a political genius Napoleon was. He outfoxes the man who engineers the French Revolution, and then kills the French Revolution. He outboxes the guy, and
Wow.
Sieyès is completely surprised by this turn of events. But Napoleon very graciously, instead of having Sieyès imprisoned or killed, pensions him off to a chateau in the countryside with a very large sum of money.
Well,
Napoleon's
not too shabby.
he's not really vengeful. If you'll accept Napoleon as the dominant guy in the room, he's good with you. He's not going to be a vengeful. He's not vengeful, but he demands subordination.
Interesting. Let's continue our talk about how Napoleon changed France. And I'm interested in one of your books, which is titled The Great Demarcation, the French Revolution, and the Invention of Modern Property. Um, Tell me about what you mean by that invention of modern property in that title, please.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, before the French Revolution, the category of property, what people in France considered to be property during the old regime, included things that we today would not consider to be property,
Like,
like public power, like a judgeship. So, for example, judgeships on the Supreme Courts of old regime France were hereditary property, passed down from father to son. They could be sold on the open marketplace. They literally had the status of property. There are other examples too. You've heard of the feudal system, of course.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
if you own a fief, if you own a seigneurie, that's the term they used. That included not just ownership of land, but it also included ownership of the right to judge in court the criminal and civil cases of the people living on that land. And
Oh,
like
wow.
just like the offices in the judicial offices, the fiefs and seigneuries could be bought, sold, just like property, inherited. And so, in other words, you could buy and sell public power. Public power was for sale. And it
Was
was
that
considered
unique to
legitimate.
France, or did
It is particularly pronounced in France, but it is not unique to France. Other countries, including the colonial United States or pre-United States, colonial America, had elements of this too. The historian Gordon Wood has written extensively about this. Um, the idea that to a certain extent, power and your public position were considered to be forms of property. This is a pre-modern, a kind of old regime European kind of norm. You can see it above all in kingship. Kings are seen as owners of their kingdoms. The sovereign is not just exercising a kind of abstract right of power over the people in his kingdom. He's actually owning the land in the kingdom as a property owner.
so the revenue of the state and the king's personal purse were one and the same in essence?
That's right. In fact, in countries like in England, England is this way for all of its moderate government and liberty. England, to this very day, in England, the only person who is considered to be a full property owner in England right now is the monarch.
Wait,
Everybody
I
else,
didn't follow that sentence. Say that again. Full
if you,
property owner. What does that
yeah,
mean?
the only person in England today who owns outright, free and clear, owns outright, holds their property from nobody else, but owns it completely independently and fully, is the monarch.
How does that make
Everybody
sense?
else,
If I go to, we were just in London this summer. If I buy a house in London, I've bought it. Who else owns it?
well, you can buy it under two kinds of contract. You can buy it in a contract called leasehold, in which you are buying ownership of the house for a period of years, up to
Oh,
999 years. Yes, many properties in England are leasehold properties, so that at the end of that term, that property returns to its lord, who in many cases is the monarch.
Oh,
So that's
wow.
not full property. But then there's a more substantial kind of property right in England called freehold,
Yeah.
where there's no term of years. It looks like full ownership of the property, except legally you are holding it from the crown.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's called freehold because you're holding your property from the crown, but you are free of paying the crown any feudal obligations or services. But the basic fact is, in English law to this very day, the monarch is considered legally the lord and property holder of the entire land of England.
That is so interesting.
And
I'll have to.
all European monarchies were like this a long time ago.
So okay, so how did he change property? We talked about this, public power. Uh, was it a decree? Was it, I mean, that's a substantial change within a system, right?
Yeah, it's a massive change. But the French revolutionaries commit themselves to abolishing this kind of hierarchical form of property in which you hold your property from a superior. Um, they commit to doing this in 1789, and what it's called, the kind of label that they give to that operation of turning this um, hierarchical dependent chain of property system into free and clear independent property that's beholden to no one. They call that the abolition of feudalism. That's what the abolition of feudalism is.
I see.
Feudalism is essentially a model of property owning, and
Of course.
that involves these hierarchical chains of holding, dependence, domination. And the French revolutionaries decide to abolish all that, and they
Yeah,
do it. It's a very complicated system. It takes a long, long time. It's still not completely done, even by the time Napoleon is packed off to St. Helena. But it, it the process is finally completed in the mid 19th
it
century.
also gets rid of corruption in a big way,
Well, I mean, I don't.
introduces efficiencies, and also, I guess, some sort of meritocracy. If you're
Yeah, that was one of the arguments for it, for trying to create free and clear, independently owned property. It was to give property owners an incentive to improve their lands.
I see.
Um, it also had a political motivation, which is um, to allow citizens to be independent. The idea being that if you own your property free and clear and are not dependent on a superior lord, you can express your political will without any kind of constraint. You can express yourself freely. But if you are holding your property from a powerful lord and are dependent on that lord and have to pay that lord feudal dues and have to sit in the lord's court and be judged, are you really going to have a free vote? Or are
That's
you going to be
fascinating.
under the influence of that proprietary superior?
That is interesting. You're right. We'll be back after a short break to talk about Napoleonic Wars. We'll be right back. Dr. Blaufarb, there's a certain fascination with Napoleon and his battle genius that came much later in his career. And many people today, including those who know very little about Napoleon, sort of hold this romantic notion about the Napoleonic Wars. Um, we think of them as sort of chivalrous, and they predate the industrial wars that came on later in the 19th century, such as the Franco-Prussian War or the U.S. Civil War. So my question is this: how unprecedented were the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, they were actually, let's just say, precedented. They were fought with exactly the same technology and tactics as previous wars in the 18th century had been fought.
Mm, okay.
There's no technological innovation whatsoever. The standard weapon that soldiers are using is a smoothbore musket, and
Oh,
that particular weapon being relatively inaccurate and having relatively short range dictated a certain form of tactics, uh, linear tactics, essentially to get the most out of that kind of weapon. Armies would form themselves up in long linear formations and essentially blaze away at each other at relatively short range with these wildly inaccurate weapons. But if you line up thousands of people all shooting in the same direction with these weapons, they're pretty formidable. So
you ought to hit something.
yeah, exactly.
So
And
rifles weren't invented then yet?
rifles had been invented actually a long time earlier, but
Uh-huh.
they were hunting weapons. The reason that rifles are not used on the battlefield is because they're expensive to make. They're a kind of more precision
Yeah.
weapon. They're more expensive to make, and they also take an ungodly amount of time to reload. So
Oh,
a rifleman cannot get off a lot of shots. I don't know, maybe one shot every minute or two, whereas a musketeer can shoot 3 or 4 shots a minute.
I see. And with that number of people at that, soldiers each side, you have a huge volley.
Exactly. So you think of the way I like to describe it to my class is to my students is that essentially the combination of the smoothbore musket and the linear formations, it turns it turns battalions and regiments into collective human machine guns.
Wow. Um, okay, so technologically, it was precedented. Was the scale of the warfare unprecedented?
That's what's unprecedented.
There you go.
The number of soldiers involved in these wars was was far more than Europe and possibly anywhere in the world up to that point had ever seen. These are probably the Napoleonic Wars are, I believe, wars in human history until World War One. They dwarf the
Oh,
Civil
wow.
War. Yes, yes, they are enormous. And but to be fair to the French Revolution, not to give Napoleon credit for things he didn't invent, it's actually the French Revolution that pioneers this new kind of mass army.
How so?
In 1793, at the height of the revolution, at the height of revolutionary radicalism and instability, France is being invaded from all sides by pretty much every country in Europe. And its very survival, the revolution's very survival is at stake. The revolutionary government responds by decreeing a levy en masse. It is essentially mobilizing every single male subject between the ages of 25 and 40 for potential service in the army. On paper, the levy en masse produces an army of 1.2 million soldiers. In reality, it's more like 750,000 who actually turn up. But
That's
that
still a lot.
it is a lot, especially when you consider that the largest army Europe had seen before that date had been the armies of Louis XIV,
Mm-hmm.
nearly 100 years earlier. And Louis XIV had only managed to mobilize about 400,000 soldiers. So we're talking the French Revolution doubles or triples the previous record as far
Wow.
as army size. And Napoleon just continues this tradition.
So if we're talking about these huge numbers, then and I don't want to get into statistics or anything, the scale of death and destruction must have also been to some extent unprecedented.
Yeah, I think it probably was. And interestingly, I think it's the numbers that lead to that kind of encourage a greater level of death and destruction. The reason is this: when Napoleon comes to power, France is putting in place has just begun to put in place a permanent system of conscription, so that every year the government can call up tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of young men to fill the ranks, the depleted ranks of its armies.
Mhm.
For a general and statesman like Napoleon, who realizes, wow, every year I can get like say 200,000 more soldiers if I need them. It encourages him to be less than economical with the lives of his soldiers
Yeah.
on the battlefield because he knows they can all be replaced. And in fact, after his early brilliant victories, culminating in the 1805-1806 Austerlitz campaign and the campaign against Prussia, Napoleon increasingly relies on direct frontal assaults by essentially human wave assaults by vast conscript armies of cannon fodder that he simply throws at the enemy again and again and again, replacing them year after year after year with conscription. But his battlefield finesse is kind of diminishes as he turns more and more to like mass tactics that ultimately rest on the cheapness and the easy availability of human life.
That's so tragic.
Yeah.
Wow. He goes from military brilliance to sort of brute force. Um, in the first segment, we were talking about his roots, his back to Corsica. I'm not drawing a parallel to Hitler or anything like that. I'm just fascinated by the fact that how Hitler was also not German, yet he led Germans into war. Is that something that you've ever thought about?
About Napoleon, well, I think that by the time he's actually leading armies,
Uh-huh.
he's French now. He has become French.
Uh-huh.
One of the, whether willingly or not is a question, but the fact is that in 1793, Napoleon and his entire family are forced to flee Corsica. They
Oh,
have to,
flee.
they're driven out of the island. They're actually being threatened with violence by rival Corsican factions that oppose the French Revolution and generally oppose France. Well, the Bonaparte family, as I had mentioned earlier in our interview, had gotten in bed with the French regime right
Yeah.
after the conquest, and then got connected to the French Revolution. And so in Corsica itself, the Bonapartes are seen as traitors. They are
Oh,
seen as traitors
wow.
and they have to flee.
Interesting.
The entire family flees. And basically, Napoleon doesn't come back to Corsica in his lifetime.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Blaufarb as we get into the perspective. Dr. Blaufarb, in your opinion, why are the French so upset about the recent film Napoleon? And you mentioned Joaquin Phoenix in the earlier episodes as well, earlier segments as well.
Well, I've looked at some of the reactions by my colleagues, by my French historian friends, and there seem to be two schools of thought. Um, the most vocal criticism is that the portrayal of Napoleon and his doings is anti-French. It really does not paint Napoleon in a particularly favorable light, um, and that stretches from the portrayal by Joaquin Phoenix, a kind of lurking, sinister, unattractive character with like no real charisma or brilliance or much of anything, um, to the absences in the film. There's no mention of any of Napoleon's accomplishments, such as ending the French Revolution, preserving equality,
Yeah.
building lasting institutions based on equality, and laying the groundwork for France's 19th century prosperity. Things like that aren't even mentioned. And so some of my colleagues find the film to be a typically anti-French, English, produced work.
I love it. The way you set up their point of view, it does make the film look one-sided.
Yeah. But there is another school of thought, and
Uh-huh.
this is the one that I subscribe to. I've heard it most articulately advanced by the dean of Napoleonic studies, a really eminent scholar, Jean Toulard. Toulard is interesting because not only is he the leading historian of Napoleon in the world, but also he is an extremely accomplished film historian.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes, and so he has all of the qualifications. And interestingly, his criticism doesn't doesn't really he doesn't really get too upset about the supposed anti-French message of the film. He just thinks it's a terrible film. He thinks that the script is awful. I think it's a terrible script. The script is awful, and the casting is abysmal because the acting is terrible. So
So you
presumably,
say you think so you share his opinion?
absolutely. And interesting, he has gone he has reviewed in great detail the many Napoleon films that have been written, not written. Silly me, I'm a historian. I speak that way. I think that way. The many films that have been produced about Napoleon, and he's reviewed the different Napoleons, and he finds the Joaquin Phoenix Napoleon to be absolutely like bottom of the barrel.
Oh
Just
boy.
very unconvincing, just strangely unconvincing.
It's got
Um,
low reviews as well and Rotten Tomatoes and all of that. Yeah.
Unfortunately for Napoleonic scholars like myself, we were hoping for a kind of windfall of interest in students, but oh well.
Yeah. Uh, Not that it matters, but I have to share this. I couldn't get anyone to go see the film with me. So they're like, no, it's got low reviews. You mentioned your colleagues, then you mentioned the Dean of Napoleonic Studies. And I'm curious about your own institute. Can you tell us about the Institute on Napoleon and the French Revolution that you are the head of?
Yes, it's a unit within the Florida State University History Department.
Hmm.
Its mission, it was founded in 1990 by the Board of Governors of Florida, of the state of Florida. Its mission is purely graduate education. What it does is it supervises and encourages graduate work, master's degrees and PhDs on Napoleonic and French Revolutionary history. Um, over the years, since 1990, it has produced. I hate to use that word when talking about students, human beings, but it has
Yeah.
produced something like 50 master's degrees and maybe 50 or more doctoral degrees, and its alumni teach all over the United States.
How did this focus on Napoleonic studies uh, develop in Florida State University?
Well, what happened was one of the members of the history department, Dr. Don Horward, recently deceased. Dr. Don Horward was just a member of the faculty of the history department, but he was extremely passionate about Napoleon, and he was an extremely gifted, persuasive, charismatic organizer, as well as a fantastic teacher and lecturer.
Yeah.
And he had a kind of force of character and the personality means to achieve his vision. And his vision was to set up a center of Napoleonic studies, his passion at the university where he taught. And by dint of will and charisma and a whole lot of effort, many hundreds of letters and meetings with people, he finally managed to get this institute set up. It's very hard to get anything set up in a university. They are very slow
Oh,
moving
I know.
bureaucracies, but Horward managed to do this. And I am fortunate to have inherited the directorship of the institute he created. I'm its second director. He
Yeah.
was the first for many years, and it's a fantastic, unique institution. It is literally the only institute in the United States where you can specifically get a degree, a graduate degree in Napoleonic and Revolutionary Studies.
I know when I was researching a guest for this program, and you're the top person that I thought of, and I'm very delighted that you joined our program. I literally noticed that this is the only institution of its kind in the United States, and that fascinated me. Hence my question: is there a museum attached to this institute?
Initially there were all kinds of plans for museums and whatnot, but that never happened, which in some ways is a good thing because
Why?
it means that instead of the Napoleon and French Revolution Institute being off somewhere in its own palatial building, separate from the general life of the history department,
Yeah,
it is actually integrated with, into, participates in the general history department, and that means that the graduate students who are in the Napoleon Institute are full-fledged members of the Florida State history community, instead of being off in a kind of
yeah,
gilded ghetto somewhere,
yeah,
maybe isolated from their colleagues, maybe looked upon with jealousy by their peers. It's a much better. I think it's much better that the institute remained focused on academia and didn't try to branch out into things like collecting,
yeah.
museums, exhibitions,
That makes
libraries.
sense. That makes sense. Let's close our conversation, Dr. Flaubarb, by going back to the movie, and specifically, I want to go to something you said, Napoleon's accomplishments, and how it didn't come across. It wasn't shown in the movie. So, what is Napoleon's legacy?
Well, he has several legacies. The main one, the reason why there's a movie at all about Napoleon, in fact, the reason why there's so many movies about Napoleon, is his reputation. He forged a lasting reputation, a lasting image that was really quite unique, a kind of the image of a self-made hero, who rose from nothing to the greatest heights of power, glory, and brilliance. There's a lot of truth to that image, but there's also a lot of deliberate curating
Yeah,
on Napoleon's part. But that is the lasting image. It's not so much that Napoleon was brilliant, great, and magnificent. It's the rags to riches element to that
yeah.
he rose from nothingness, and he created that kind of model for people to aspire to.
But that nothingness, that could be his propaganda, because as I understand it, his family was relatively well off in Corsica, right?
That's correct. Yes, the Bonapartes, they were relatively minor nobles by the standards of the royal court of France,
Yeah,
but by the standards of Corsica, they were very important local power players.
yeah, yeah. So, but he was able to curate that image to make it sound like he came from nothing, rags to riches. Dr. Blaufarb, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. I loved it.